Well, hi there, and welcome to I'm All Over the Place. My name is Dara Star Tucker, and I am so happy to be joined today by Dr. Boni Wozolek, who is, I'm going to allow you to kind of introduce yourself, Dr. Boni, and tell us exactly what your area of specialty is. But I've done several videos recently on the issue of cultural appropriation, particularly between minority groups, and have done a lot of that content in the past. So we want to kind of have a deep dive discussion with someone who is an academic, who is a specialist in this area, and can give us some further insight into that. So having said that, Dr. Boni, would you please introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, so my name is Boni Wozolek. I am an associate professor at Penn State Abington, so just a little bit outside of Philadelphia. And I'm also currently serving as the inaugural Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusive Excellence, and Belonging for our campus. My background, a little bit about my background, I was a K-12 teacher actually for over a decade. And I had one of the very last multi-age licenses in the first state where I started teaching. And so I started with the really littles and pre-K to second, worked some time in middle school, and then finished my career teaching high school. My line of research specifically I'm in the field of curriculum studies and educational foundations. So it's really a question of educational histories, what we learn, how we learn, who has access to knowledge, whose knowledge is of most worth is a very classic curriculum studies question. And my specific work that I do is thinking about questions of marginalized populations and educational context really broadly. So I specifically think about students of color and queer and questioning youth and their allies and the intersections therein, and education very broadly. For example, I had done work with women in India who were survivors of intimate partner violence, and thinking about cultural contexts of education and how culture educates us in lots of ways. So that's the work that I do as a scholar and as an educator more broadly.
Okay. Well, you're you're overqualified really to have this discussion because, the space that I operate in is I'm not an educator. I did teach elementary school for a couple of years way back in the day, but I do not think of myself as necessarily as an educator. I guess what I do does kind of fall into the education space online, but a lot of what I end up doing in online spaces is communicating with people who have kind of a general interest in a lot of these topics, but really do not have a lot of time to study them very deeply or don't take a lot of time to study these issues very deeply. So I end up having, many sort of, irritating, I'll say, conversations in the comments section with people. I just was talking to one guy today who wasn't necessarily a troll, but he was someone who basically came back and said, well, this is a video I did on cultural appropriation between minority groups. He's like, well, you don't respect anyone's opinion that's not, like yours, because I feel this way. And I feel like culture should just be able to exchange. And, you're trying to police people, just those general types of arguments. And basically coming back at me with, well, this is just your opinion. You don't necessarily know. I'm someone with an opinion and you're someone with an opinion, and you just need to listen to what I have to say. And of course, my response is cultural appropriation, cultural appreciation, acculturation. These are topics that have definitions. They have meanings. There are people who have observed these social phenomena and who have really made a practice and a study of understanding what these things mean on a very, nuanced level. And you can actually go and research these things and come to a better understanding of what people mean when they use these terms. And we can understand that it's not really just about policing behaviors. And as I said in one video, separating the carrots and peas and trying to keep everyone separate. And, we understand that cultures influence each other, but this is not really just about policing people's behavior around cultures. So can you kind of give us, I guess, just a general overview of like why people should care about this stuff? Why should they study it on a deep level? I mean, words like cultural appropriation. I'm working right now on a video about Paul Simon's Graceland and how that sort of fits into this conversation. And it's like, one of the things I say at the beginning is this was not even a term that was really used very much at that time. Most people wouldn't have known what cultural appropriation meant. So why is this something that even needs to be studied or understood by most people?
Well, it's I'm laughing because I have children, and I was actually just having a conversation with my 12-year-old over the weekend about this, who's trying to grapple with it herself. And what does this mean in her own life, and how can she think and be not just reflective, but reflexive? That's a term that I use not only in my household, but with my students quite a lot, right? So not just thinking about yourself, but thinking about yourself as you are constantly in touch with and a part of other people and other structures more specifically, right? So when I think about this, part of it is that it's complicated, and it should be complicated. And even as a scholar who thinks very deeply, I'm a qualitative researcher. I engage in what's called sonic ethnographic work after my research thesis advisor, Walter Gershon's work. And I think a whole lot about how do we understand how things resonate? How are things in dissonance with each other? What does it mean when we're studying people and practices, and culture is always being made and unmade, right? And then what does it mean to, as Brandon McDermott would say, to live in a particular house, right, that's built, and to take responsibility in a way for certain cultural norms and values that we sit with. And so when I think about these topics and the work that I do, part of it is leaning into the complications of the unknown. I think that right now I'm watching, I think it's specific to a lot of people, but maybe more broadly to other types of cultures, where we have to know, right? There's almost a dangerous point in not knowing, and saying I need to lean into saying I'm not sure about this, and maybe because it's so complicated, we need to go back to practicing coalition politics. We need to go back to listening deeply to each other, as Pauline O'Veris would say, and doing that kind of work together in communities rather against each other in communities. And I think that that's a strong starting point for me. And that's really hard, I think, for a lot of folks to sort of grapple with that sense of uncertainty. In terms of cultural appreciation, appropriation, again, it's slippery, but it's connected to power dynamics, right? So in one of your videos, I had noticed that you had referenced this idea of cultural plagiarism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that term, as you look at it, really is leaning into questions of structures of power. Mm-hmm. It's leaning into questions of politics and gender and race, and these things that happen when questions of cultural appropriation or appreciation have become empty signifiers, right? So we have used them so much, we're not quite sure what they mean. And when I think about what this means in terms of why we should all be thinking about this, for me, it's because although it's a concept, you might think of it as an academic concept, you might think of it as something that belongs to certain contexts, but the reality is that the term and the idea lands on bodies and people, right? And it hits bodies and people in a particular way that we need to pay attention to in ways that can be harmful. And so when we're thinking about what can actively cause harm to people and to communities, I think that's something that we need to, as a very broad sense as humans, human animals, if you're thinking about this from, a post-humanist to be very academic or new materialist stance. If we're thinking about the human in context, then we do need to think about what it means to cause harm, whether it's intentional or unintentional, to people and groups, and what kind of harm we're causing, and how we can interrupt that, how we can resist it, and how we can refuse it.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's a really important word to zero in on, is harm, because like I said, a lot of these conversations, they're not being had at the academic level. These are not people who are sitting in classrooms and who are taking in this information holistically and really understanding it on a very deep kind of historical level in the context that you as an academic would be able to present it to someone in. I have literally maybe 3 to 5 minutes, maybe, with people, and many people will not even stay and watch a video for that length of time. They're going to take in 60 seconds of content, and then they want to comment and push back on certain things. So I think, it's important to be able to, for someone like me, to be able to communicate these concepts, which some of them can be very complex, to be able to communicate these concepts in a way that is simple. I always say I try to aim my content for maybe a really smart high schooler, like a 15, 16-year-old. to communicate this information in a way that's simple, that's straightforward, that doesn't kind of get people too deep in the weeds about it. So I do want to talk about that word harm, because I have used that word in a couple of my presentations. But I also want to address the idea that I do feel coming from, I'll say, a certain group of folks, and we can probably guess, who that specific group of people are, that for a lot of people, it feels very scary to have conversations around what they feel is limiting or policing cultural exchange. Because obviously, and I approach a lot of this stuff from the standpoint of an artist. I'm a singer myself and a performer. I talk about these things. As I said, I'm getting ready to do a video on Paul Simon's Graceland. I talk about a lot of these things in the sense, in the context of music. And as we know, the history of our music, especially in the United States, is an amalgam of a whole lot of things. If we didn't have free and open cultural exchange, artistic exchange, we wouldn't have most of the music that we love in this country. Our musical history would not be as rich. So can you kind of speak to that, I guess, that concern with a lot of folks that we are entering when we really start to dissect and pull some of these issues apart, around the harm that can be caused through things like cultural appropriation? Can you kind of speak to some of those concerns that a lot of people address with me? Like, hey, we're walling ourselves off, and we're kind of changing the whole concept of how we move forward culturally, or even, specifically musically.
Well, I think I can't necessarily speak to it musically. While I work in sound studies, I am not a musician. My 12-year-old will remind you of that anytime I sing it. There's no doubt about that. But what I can speak to is how we can understand these things in sociocultural, political understandings, right? And there are a couple of things that become significant when I consider these topics. The first is going back to, again, Walter Gershon's work, who I can't recommend enough. Look it up if you haven't. Can
you say that name again?
It's Walter Gershon, Gershon,
okay.
Right? And he does really beautiful work thinking about educational contexts and sounds. And so really worth thinking about. But one of the things he says is breaking down to what he would say is a question of your intentions, attention, expression, and reception, right? Mm-hmm. So what are the intentions with which you're doing something? What are you paying attention to when you carry those things out? How are those things expressed, right? What is the expression of those things? And then something we can't necessarily always control, or I would say that we have very little control over, which is reception. And so as a musician, I'm sure that you can have a lot of intention and attention to the way you express yourself vocally, right? Mm-hmm. How that becomes received can sometimes be in tension with all of the other things that you've thought about before that form of expression that comes out musically, right? Mm-hmm. And so when I think about this question of cultural appropriation, or what people would say is cultural appreciation, and what is the tension there? On one hand, there's that tension that exists between what you felt you have expressed, right, mm-hmm. and what you have expressed is received by other people. Mm-hmm. And I want to sort of lean into that, because also getting into the mix of this is a question of identity politics, which on one hand can be really helpful, right? I don't want to ever take away the tools of folks when they are using those tools to interrupt and resist and refuse oppressive norms and values. On the other hand, as we've seen, identity politics can also be used as a tool of exclusion, right? Mm-hmm. And so when we think about how culture is made and unmade consistently, we also have to consider questions of power, right? So it's a question of access, right? Who has access to what? And then when I think about cultural appropriation, I think about just the word appropriate, right? For whom is it appropriate to do what? And that's a really messy question. Not one that I necessarily wish to answer with some black or white. It should always already be entangled. And this is where I think that being reflexive, going back to this deep reflexivity of saying, well, where do I sit in this? And what was my intention, right? How was I expressing that? Was I thinking about myself as just myself? Was I being reflective, or was I being reflexive myself as I'm always in touch with all of these other things in the world. And so I do wonder how much people are engaging that way when they're thinking about cultures, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're thinking about different pieces of different cultures, what this means musically, what it means in the fashion world. Are we thinking about how the power dynamics can be further marginalizing, right? So if I think about going back to this question of cultural plagiarism, going back to the fashion world, going back to what how I assume the music world works as well, is are you taking, borrowing, stealing, however you want to look at that, certain pieces, parts of other cultures, using it for your own capital gain, not allowing any form of dialogue around where that came from, and are you using that capital gain to benefit the communities from which you took those things, right? Those are all questions that I have when we lean into this conversation.
Mm-hmm. So do you feel, and again, pulling a question from this same conversation that I was having earlier today, you spoke about harm.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel that there are certain cases in which there is not harm that's done, particularly if this is minority culture, this is happening between minority cultures? I mean, is this always a harmful thing? And how do we assess that? I mean, obviously there's no kind of black and white answers, but how can you speak to that issue of harm?
Well, I would never speak in absolutes that way. That's just not how I function as a scholar or as a person.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wouldn't say that it always causes harm, right?
Mm-hmm.
I can say that it depends, again, on a lot of other variables and how you lean into things as to what harm is caused, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you brought up the example of, can there be cultural appropriation between minorities, for example,
Mm-hmm.
and would we consider that harmful? I think that there are lots of situations where there might, for example, be a Black artist artists in a very broad sense, right, who relies very heavily on Southeast Asia, for example,
Mm-hmm.
Or a designer, for example, that relies heavily on even Southeast Asian factories, and incorporates elements of Southeast Asian culture into the design.
Mm-hmm.
That's a type of exploitation, right, between what would be considered two minorities.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, I'm going to say, yeah, harm is caused, and
Mm-hmm.
we need to think about what that means, particularly in the fashion industry, when we're exploiting people, cultures, and land, right,
Mm-hmm.
to bring fashion to other nations, right? What does that mean, and how do we interrupt those things? It gets really messy really fast. At the same time, I don't necessarily know that to say that I didn't mean to, right? Or I think in the one article I was reading, it said like, well, it's just hair.
Mm-hmm.
Well, no, it's not just hair, right? Let's just pause there and say that might be significant to one's culture and and to one's histories, and to in some cases forms of oppression. And we need to say it's not just hair, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're going to think very deeply about this and the harm that's caused by dismissing things. And so I don't ever want to say it couldn't cause harm, because it might cause harm that I don't even know about, right? Mm-hmm. And so again, I think that's where we sit in the complication and we say, okay, am I causing harm that I don't even know about,
Mm-hmm.
Even by my comments? And is that something I'm okay with, right? And that's something you have to sit with yourself. That's not just a question. It's an inquiry, as my good friend Reagan Mitchell would say, because you have to sit with it for longer. And I think that's worth taking the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, for you to bring up hair, because this is always a hot button issue. And again, I'm working in the online space. This is social media. The interactions are very terse. They're very just kind of, we got the rowdy section and folks that just want to pop off about any and everything. These are not deeply intellectual conversations a lot of the time that are being had around this issue. So I will say that. But you bring up the issue of hair. This is one of the big pushbacks that I get when I start to show examples of fashion choices or hair choices that people can make that very clearly are heavily referencing someone's culture, or referencing an aesthetic that is reflective of someone else's culture. So Box braids would be a very clear example. I mean, it's a very popular thing right now to reference hip hop culture. I mean, it's kind of been the dominant fashion to reference, I think, in popular culture for a little while now. But people really, they tighten up around hair specifically, and then you end up having these very tedious, even silly conversations around, well, Vikings wore braids and you don't own braids, and trying to get people to understand, like, we are not specifically trying to regulate who's wearing braids, and that one culture owns the idea of braids. That's not really what's at issue. So when someone brings up something like box braids, or dreadlocks, or those sorts of choices that are very clearly referencing a very specific cultural aesthetic. What is sort of the grounding, I guess, that you give for even presenting this as an issue that is worthy of discussion? Because for a lot of people, it just feels very nitpicky. It feels very gatekeepy. It gets trivialized and it gets minimized a lot. And so why, can you kind of talk to us about why this is not maybe something that should be trivialized?
Yeah, I mean, I always encourage people, whether, it was a high school student I was teaching, or whether it's a college student that I'm working with, to think about educating themselves, right? That's not something that I feel like we do enough of sometimes, right? Even on my own social media pages, I was scrolling through Facebook the other day, and I know that dates me, and my students would tell me that makes me very old. I get it, fine. But one of the things I noticed is people would say, hey, Facebook hive mind, and then ask a question. Rather than saying, hey, folks, these are the steps that I've taken to understand this deeply, right? Can you please send me your thoughts, any resources you have, so I can engage even further on this topic? And so it's odd to me, at a moment when we have, at least here in the United States, I'm speaking from this context, the ability to get on the internet and have at our fingertips so many resources. There are folks who will use their opinion as it intersects with what they've seen immediately. And then it's like the curiosity stops, right? And this goes to what you were saying earlier about folks not listening to an entire, 3-minute long video. Right. So one of the things that I have done is one of my most recent books is a sonic ethnographic study. So I worked with Black and Brown students in a predominantly white space for 2 years, and they made a lot of sound recordings, hours and hours of sound recordings. And then rather than transcribing that data, there's a QR code and you can listen to them. Well, on the back end, like a lot of these platforms, I can see how much somebody has engaged with the sound file, how long they've engaged with the sound file. And this is more often than not a young person talking about the forms of oppression that they've lived with, right? And listen for about the first, I would say 30 to 45 seconds at most, and then they're done. And that tells me that either they feel like they've gotten it, right? Which is a question of how deeply are you really engaging with another person's story? Or are you only engaging with yourself, right? I think I've gotten the entire point, and therefore I'm done. It's a question, though, to me, of curiosity. Where is this going? Rather than having a foregone conclusion. And so I think that what I'm watching, and what as a professor makes me a little worried, is that sometimes there's a lack of curiosity. And I'm consistently asking my students to remain curious, right? To continue to engage in not knowing and saying, okay, well, I don't know much about, for example, how Black women wear their hair. I don't know those histories. I'm going to engage in that for a little bit. And I'm going to engage with it across types of media, right? I'm not just going to scroll into TikTok and look up the hashtags and say, well, okay, my research is done. I'm going to look at different reference materials and think like, okay, I want to be informed about this before I engage in it myself for my body. Right. But again, leaning into the complications of things, I have one child who presents very much like me with dark hair and brown skin. I have one child who has blonde hair and blue eyes. right?
Mm-hmm.
Very different looking kids. And when I think about my own home culture, which is, I'm biracial, half Indian, I wonder, like, if my son, for example, who is light skinned, blonde hair, blue eyes, decides to wear a kurta, is he going to be called out for cultural appropriation? So there's another question, there's another layer here for me, which is always how we ourselves are engaged in communities, right? And then what it means to be engaged in a community and invited into that community and invited into those cultural points. What does it mean in a world where you could have two very different looking children? They both wear salwar kameezes or kurtas or whatever it is, and then one's called out for cultural appropriation, one's not, right? You know, I have a Mangalsutra on. I constantly have people say, "Do you know that that's Indian?" Yes, I'm biracial. And so those get into really contentious lines that I think we need to pay attention to. So I think for me, there's this question of how do we educate ourselves before we engage into things, right? How do we think about I guess, have open consideration and curiosity for other people in front of us, rather than saying, okay, well, this looks like a white man, he can't be playing Afro-Cubana music, right? That's surely not, that's outside of the bounds of what he can do, right? And then if we don't have that invitation in from other communities, then really thinking ourselves about, if I engage, what are the histories with which I'm engaging? And do engaging in these histories cause harm to other people? If the answer is yes, is that something I'm willing to do, right? And so for me, I'm always gonna sit or stand or be on the side of the oppressed. Period. The end, right? And so knowing that these things are complicated, I'm going to be very careful with how I understand these things, and I'm going to ask a lot of questions rather than just making assumptions. And that's the thing that social media gives us, is the ability to make a quick assumption, a snap judgment, put it on, and have anonymity that allows us to feel as if we don't have responsibility, and we do. And so even in these moments of it's cultural appropriation or appreciation, and to be really clear, there are times that it certainly just is, right? My daughter, when she was in, I want to say, first grade, I was very busy with my first academic job. And so I'll admit to not paying as close of attention as I should have. She was in the school play. I went to go see her school play, and it was Peter Pan. The abridged format of Peter Pan. And as an academic and a parent, I just sat there and cringed and thought, what on earth is going on here? And then had lots of words, behind the scenes with the administrator and with the choir director and lots of folks who didn't understand why it was problematic, right? And didn't understand why it was harmful, right? And said things like, well, I don't think we have any Indigenous parents. Stop. Stop, right? Right there. You're making a lot of assumptions about the people and or their connections, right? Whether or not there's an Indigenous parent in the room is irrelevant to me. Yeah. And so these things become problematic when we stop being curious. And so I always caution people away from things that block our ability to be curious about ourselves, about others, about histories, and not to engage in those things fully. Because as I told my students, the amount of times that you spend, I believe the term is doom scrolling, across social media platforms, you could have looked something up on Google. Yeah. Whatever platform you choose to look stuff up on. So it's a choice. You're choosing not to be curious.
Yeah. And I've started to zero in on that more, again, in the online space, mostly comment sections where I'm interacting with people around these issues. But I've started to call that out a lot more these days than I used to, where I would, a lot of these videos that I'm doing right now are reposts of things that I did, a year and a half, 2 years ago. I engage with this very differently now than I did then, because I would be willing to get kind of into the weeds with people and have these sort of back and forth conversations about whether Vikings were wearing dreadlocks 3,000 years ago, and, having these sort of silly, what I feel are really silly discussions around things that I feel like people on really actually do understand on a deeper level. They just want to deflect and not have the conversation that is being had. And so I feel like I've gotten a little wiser around this and how to have conversations around these issues, because, as you said, a lot of this kind of thing really does boil down to a curiosity and an openness and a willingness to understand how our behavior affects other people. And if we start from that place, then the questions that we're asking are different than if we are not starting from a place of wanting to understand how our behavior impacts other people, regardless of what our intentions are. I have a kind of a general question, and this is more just sort of an observational thing from your standpoint as someone who works in these sort of, would you say that you work in the sort of behavioral sciences, or not behavioral sciences, but more of like a social scientist perspective? What I feel like I encounter quite a bit is just the lack when we start having conversations around culture, because I'm no expert, but I can engage in and have a basic conversation around the concept of culture, and which is even just the launching point for how a conversation around cultural appropriation develops. But we have to start with even understanding what culture is to begin with, or having, as you said, a curiosity or a desire to understand what culture is. And I feel like a lot of the pushback that I have received, a lot of the the disputes and things that happen around this issue really stems from a lack of understanding on the part of a lot of folks, a lack of understanding of what culture even is. Mm-hmm. And these are not just young people, because Facebook, you mentioned Facebook can be the worst. YouTube, Facebook, where there is an older crowd trying to attempt to put out content like this and have conversations like this. It's just as bad, if not worse, to try and have these conversations with people who are over the age of 35. So there is not kind of a basic understanding amongst a wide swath of the population, from my observation, and there's not an understanding or a respect for culture in and of itself with large groups of people. Mm-hmm. And I can't say it's just with white audiences, but oftentimes I encounter this issue with white followers, even if they do have the best of intentions. It's not that they're necessarily just trying to be caustic or push back, but they are having a difficult time wrapping their heads around a conversation about cultural appropriation, because then they immediately start pushing to questions about, well, what about Beyonce dyeing her hair blonde? Or, you wore a tennis shoe. A tennis shoe was invented by a white man, or something like that. We'll just have kind of these endless exchanges about, well, Fats Domino's playing the piano, and the piano was invented by, we'll just get into these sort of needless, just threading back to who invented what, or who came up with what, or whose culture developed what. So just having conversations around what culture is a difficult thing to do. I guess from the perspective of someone in the United States, and I'll specifically ask with regard to oftentimes the white audiences, not even necessarily talking about conversations with minorities. Why would you feel, and have you encountered the idea that it is difficult to have conversations about culture if you are dealing with these non-minority students, white students? Is it difficult to even introduce this idea of culture? And if so, why has this been difficult for them to get their heads around? That's my experience, and I don't want to make the assumption that has been your experience. So please let me know what your experience has been.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I am, although I work in educational anthropology, I am in the education program here, right? But I also teach generalist courses. Mm-hmm. And so I'm laughing because our campus is the campus with the most, with the highest number of the highest number of minority students in the entire Penn State system. Okay. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of students who come from Philadelphia. We have a strong international student population. And so we have a lot of students of color, or people who identify as students of color, here on our campus. What is not only interesting, but very unfortunately normal, is then when you get students, by the time I have juniors and seniors who have cohorted up into the education program, it's almost all white women. right?
Mm.
So I go from teaching rather diverse classes when they're freshmen and sophomores, first year and second year students, to their third and fourth year. What ends up happening is we tend to see students who are far less diverse in perspective, sometimes in background, right? Socioeconomic status. So it's interesting to see that progression. And the reason that I bring that up is because then the question is, who's teaching our babies in schools, right? And what perspectives are they bringing with them? And how is that, what are the limitations with what knowledge is given in schools, right? So when people, meaning in this case for me, doctoral students, will say, I need to define culture. And I remember as a doctoral student, this is something I struggled with as well, frankly, because the question is always, first and foremost for me, through whose lens, from an academic standpoint, are you defining culture? That matters, right? If it's a non-academic standard or way of seeing the world, lens, I should say, it's not a question of culture, it's a question of cultures, right? And so when I'm on a platform like Facebook, interacting with maybe more seasoned family members and friends, in that case, it's not, what I see is perhaps sometimes a singular definition of culture, right? This is culture with a capital C. And that can be dangerous territory, right? When I interact with younger people who have different types of experiences and different interactions, I would say, with media, I think that matters. It's not necessarily that they suddenly get culture. What I've noted is that they have the tools, meaning the words, to speak about culture, right? To speak about questions of diversity, equity, inclusion. But having the tools and knowing how to use those tools are not always the same thing. And that's the concern that I have with the younger generations as they're coming up, to have the tools, but not necessarily know how to use the tools. When we think about curiosities and knowing how to engage with, in not heavy research, I'm not asking that people write a thesis on it, but engage with different sources to have an opinion that is multifaceted. I think that sometimes people have the tools, they've been given the tools of the internet, for example, but not really understanding how to deeply engage with that, right? To help them form and inform an opinion. So I think that culture should always be cultures. I think we should always be really careful with how we use that. And I think we should be really careful about how we police and gatekeep at the same time. Not to say that there shouldn't be a degree of gatekeeping to keep people safe, right? And that gets really, really hard too. I'm not saying that we should always gatekeep to keep people safe in ways that are also harmful to other people. There's a both and that I would like to speak to in that regard. So when we think about culture or cultures, for me, and then like, how are you appropriating? How are you taking, which is, I think a better question, like how are you taking, using, and either not affirming the culture from which it came from, or how are you taking, using, and not giving back to the culture from which it came from, right? I think that those become really important questions that we need to be consistently in touch with. I don't know that people who are perhaps more seasoned in life, it's not that they're not in touch with that necessarily, but I think that sometimes I see a more singular view of this is the culture. And with younger people, sometimes I see this is my culture. And gatekeeping through identity politics that makes it difficult to have a conversation. I don't know that either one is right or wrong, right? I worry about how they interact. That's the bigger question and concern for me.
So I don't know if I'm understanding you correctly. You said gatekeeping around identity politics. So to say, am I understanding that you're saying having conversations about let's say Black American culture? This is, where I come from.
Sure.
Is that maybe I don't want to say dangerous, but is that a risky or an ill-advised conversation to be having around my identity? I'll very much personalize it around my identity as a Black person in the United States of America, to speak about culture in a general sense of Black people in the US. Do you feel like there's a danger in having that specific conversation with regard to culture?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
And I would never say that anyone shouldn't speak on their identity to explain their background. The question for me is always, are you willing to lean into the complications of culture? Are
Mhm.
you willing to lean into the complications of identity? Okay.
Mhm.
So, for example, I'm a biracial woman. A lot of people would not look at me and say, she's half Indian, right?
Mhm.
And in fact, there are Indians who would say, I don't know that you're quite Indian enough, right?
Mhm.
I also lived for many years in a Midwestern context where I certainly wasn't white enough, right?
Mhm.
And so I think that when we police, let's just leave it in questions of perceptions of race, right? And we police those things based on how we identify other people
Mhm.
without taking the time to listen, because it's about your experience with being marginalized, without hearing how other folks could be minoritized also. That becomes a really dangerous moment in identity politics. What is quote unquote not enough, right? Um, I'm bisexual. Am I queer enough? I have been
Mhm.
told by people in my queer community that I'm not queer enough, right? Um,
Mhm.
it gets really, I think, with identity politics, when identity politics sort of smashes into these questions of culture and whose culture and who's for whom is culture appropriate, right? Um, I think that we can unintentionally or sometimes very intentionally minoritize people, right? So there's this academic understanding, which I think most people can understand, regardless of if I cite it, that the oppressed will always become the oppressor, right? So um, there's always sort of this move to have and to hold positions of power. And so many times what I see is in minoritized populations, the desire, a needed desire to have sociocultural political power, right? And sometimes that's done by in-group, making sure that folks are, even within a group, have less access to power, right? That's why how we understand like colorism, right? Those things sort of
Mhm.
they happen, and I think we have to just be really careful when our identity politics sort of smash into how we understand culture altogether, right? And then how that gets exercised when we think about cultural appropriation, um, racial plagiarism, those sorts of things.
Mhm. So do you feel that there are ways where this conversation is getting a little off course? Are there corrections that you feel need to be made? I mean, what is your evaluation of how this conversation is happening in recent years?
Um, there are times that some things feel off course, but I don't think it's the conversation. I don't know. I don't necessarily know it's the conversation that you're referencing, right? When I think about things getting off course, I do think about specifically this question of identity politics. Sometimes gets off course. I think that when we get too steeped in identity politics, we can release ourselves or ignore the necessity to have coalition politics. Um, and that becomes a question of invitations into things. That becomes a question of who are your allies, accomplices, co-conspirators, and I do look at those as different things, right? And when we're thinking about pushing back against cultural appropriation, I think all of these things matter, right? And so, how do we necessarily know who has access um, to things, and how we understand that access is not harmful, right? I think for me, it always goes back to that question of harm, to that question of oppression. Um, how are things being used as tools against, toward tools for minoritized communities? Um, and just being really mindful of those things. So for me, like getting back on track, although tracks always scare me because they're too linear. Um, I think if there's anything in this conversation, hopefully folks have listened to it and understand about me, it's that I'm sort of okay being in all the complications, the complicated nature
Mhm.
that is always necessarily culture, that is always necessarily our relations to each other. But if I were to say getting back on track, quote unquote, it would be really for me this question of, can we focus in on the harm that we cause to others, whether it's intentional harm, unintentional harm, by our ways of being, knowing, and doing as they're connected to systems of power, right? And really being deeply reflective and reflexive about those things. I think that that's always a good first step to working and operating in the world in a way that foregrounds care, right? Care for cultures, care for other humans, right? And non-human bodies, right? What does that mean to foreground questions of care in what we do and how we move in the world?
Mm-hmm. So do you feel that there's a way, I mean, you've mentioned this term, identity politics, many times. I don't happen to believe that there are spaces where identity politics do not exist.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that term is thrown around a lot, and it's kind of levied against certain minority communities or communities that are advocating for particular care and concern towards marginalized groups. We hear that term kind of thrown out there as a pejorative. Oh, this is identity politics, identity politics. Do you feel that there are ways in which these marginalized groups can cause harm with too much emphasis or focus on identity politics, that they can cause harm towards non-marginalized groups? Is that, I'm not trying to necessarily put words in your mouth, but I want to understand your position, I guess, a little bit better. Are there ways in which you as an Indian woman, or as a biracial Indian woman, or me as a Black woman, can do harm in leaning in maybe too heavily to these conversations around cultural appropriation or otherizing a majority group? Are there ways that we can do harm to majority groups or non-marginalized groups around cultural appropriation, conversations around cultural appropriation?
I don't want to say that we're I think harm can always be caused no matter what, first of all, right? But what I do want to say is more significant than causing harm to a majority group is it's not necessarily, from my perspective, to a group, but there's a question of when do we, it's a very complicated sea. My bigger concern is, when do we allow these things to stop conversation, right? The entire idea of calling out versus calling in. There are moments when it is completely necessary to call somebody out, right? That person has caused physical, emotional, financial, some kind of harm to a person or to communities. Calling out becomes a very necessary tool for interrupting some kind of oppression. I don't want to ever say that people should not engage in that. There's a question for me about calling in. What does calling in look like? When do we use it? Because I think that it's not synonymous, but I think that sometimes when we think about these moments when we're saying, like, what you did is not okay. And I think that we should be able to say, it's not cool. It's not okay. Don't do that. You have caused a form of harm to a community. And perhaps there's some education around that harm, right? So I think that if the only tool we use, I think for me, thinking on this, it's a question of a singularity of tools rather than a toolbox. If the only tool we have is to call people out or to say identity politics is the only thing that matters to me, rather than broader systems of power, and how do we leverage and move against those systems of power. If we're not doing our job and using multiple tools, then I think what we're going to do is continue to replicate inequities that are, again, going to end up harming minoritized communities, right? So for me, it's a question of who's willing to be an accomplice. What does that person, what are their politics? How do I invite them in? And I don't want to, for me, I don't want to stop that process because of identity politics. And so I think what ends up happening is, if you only have the singular tool through tool and lens through which you see things, and it's always an affront, sometimes what ends up happening is you can't have deeper conversations with people in ways that can interrupt these broader sociopolitical, cultural oppressions. And that's what we need to work toward, right? On the other hand, again, there are going to be times that it's just going to be like, full stop, whatever this is needs to be interrupted without question. So I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both and. And I think it's worth really moving into that and saying, okay, how do we do this in ways that are going to be, I guess, in ways that are A, not going to cause any more harm, but B, going to be tools that we can and should engage in.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that answers the question at all.
Well, I'm trying to make sure that I understand. So what do you, when you speak about calling in versus calling out, I mean, can you lay out for us exactly what you mean and what that distinction is, and how you feel that delineation should be happening?
Yeah. I mean, so one of the things that I think happens, really, it's a normal thing for me in my classroom because the content that I teach, right? So what are the histories of schools in the United States? How can we understand schools actually as a normalized tool of oppression, right? And inevitably in an essay, I will have a student who will use colored people rather than people of color. It happens every semester.
Okay.
Without fail, every semester I get at least one, if not a handful of people, of papers that do not understand the difference. And what's interesting to me are students who don't know the difference across questions of race and class and background, right? And I'll have to say, okay, let's talk about the history of this term. And I've gotten to the point where I don't even assign a paper in the semester without having the conversation. And it still happens because even though you think people are listening, sometimes they're not. And so for me, that's a moment of calling somebody in, right? That's a moment of saying, okay, hold up. The content of this paper on eugenics was really beautiful. You got what I was laying down. You picked that stuff right on up. I appreciate that. At the same time, that's not, I'm hoping that by educating, and I'll tell people, I have you for 16 weeks. By the time you come to me, you're in your 20s. I cannot undo 20 years. You cannot undo however many years somebody had on this planet before they watched your 3-minute video, right? Like, but what you can do is spark curiosity, right? And so for me, that's always the goal. There are moments that I can't, though. So if I have a student who calls another student a racial epithet in my classroom, that's full stop. We're not going any further, right? I'm going to call you out. I'm going to say that is not appropriate, or I'm sorry, what did you say? Right? That's not appropriate in this particular place. That is not the culture of this classroom, right? So there are moments, because that's a moment when somebody has caused harm to another person in my presence. The answer is no, right? I always tell folks when I'm doing training sessions, there is a degree of care that you have to take in this. Because if you are calling somebody out, so for example, I was walking in Philadelphia a couple of weeks back, and there was a man who was just screaming at this woman, right? And her body language tells me that she does not feel safe. That's a moment that I would like to walk up to it and call it out. I'm sorry, what's going on here? Are you okay? Do you feel safe? I, as a person who, if I was on the other side of the screen, you'd see I'm not the tallest person in the world. I'm not going to approach that, right? I'm going to find other ways to interrupt that in ways that keep me safe. So it's always complicated because there's a question of your own physical safety that we need to attend to. And at the same time, you have to look at each context. It's always already contextually based and say, is this a moment where I need to put a full stop on this? Or is this a moment where somebody could perhaps benefit from the knowledges that I have benefited from as well, right? Not to say that I am suddenly, as a professor, the all-knowing, right? I'm not a big fan of that sort of model where the professor comes in and knows everything in the world. But I am privileged, right? I have a degree of privilege. I have a literal degree in privilege, right? Meaning that I had access to certain ways of knowing in the world that came from being able to get a PhD. Now, is that the only way to access that? No, I don't believe that either, right? So I think that stuff is always going to be a complex conversation, and it's always going to be contextually based. So when I think about what that means to call someone out or call someone in, that's always I need to think about this moment and decide what the outcome is for my expression, right? It's like, again, going back to that original conversation, it's a question of expression. How do I express my intentions here? And what am I paying attention to? there are certain moments, even among family members, where I know the conversation is not going to go anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm well aware. And perhaps I've tried several times. It doesn't release me from responsibility of continuing those conversations. But I do need to continue to engage in them in ways that are going to keep me emotionally safe. So
Mm-hmm.
again, questions of harm, questions of safety, but continuing to do something because that's part of what we just need, I think, in broader cultural understanding.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to kind of focus on two things, I guess, here towards the end of this conversation. I guess the question of harm, which we kind of keep coming back to, which is kind of the fundamental issue that we are addressing here with the topic of cultural appropriation is, are you, first do no harm? Are you doing harm? There are obvious and not so obvious ways to do harm. And so in the example that you gave, this is someone who's either in your classroom is using a racial epithet, or, you're walking down the street and you can see a woman who is physically being threatened, or at least verbally being threatened to the point that she is becoming physically uncomfortable. Those are very clear-cut scenarios where it is very obvious that harm is being done. And I think for this conversation around cultural appropriation, it can be difficult to have those conversations because it is not necessarily as obvious that harm is being done or when harm is being done. So I guess I would like to know from your perspective, do you feel that cultural appropriation is fundamentally harmful? Are there cases, because I'm not trying to force you into a particular stance or point of view. I want to make sure I fully understand where you're coming from. Do you feel that there has been much ado about this issue of cultural appropriation to the point where we're just sparring about it in ways that are maybe not necessary or helpful? It's just a hot button issue that a lot of folks like to, duke it out about because it's a lightning rod issue in online spaces? Or do you feel that fundamentally cultural appropriation is usually a harmful thing? What is your perspective on that?
Yeah, so here's the thing. For me, I tend to lean actually in towards this idea of the fact that cultural appropriation has become in many ways this empty signifier. And I think that when that happens, sometimes new tools, new language to really call back to the harm that it causes is important. This is why
I have to stop you. I'm sorry, because you're in such an academic space, and I want to make sure that people are following you. When you say it has become an empty signifier, yeah. Exactly what do you mean by that?
Yes, absolutely. So when I say that cultural appropriation has become in some contexts an empty signifier, what I mean is that it doesn't hold the meaning that we think it means, right? We're not necessarily attending to all the nuance that is inherent to that term, right? And so what I mean when I think of cultural appropriation, and part of this article, going back to this article on racial plagiarism, what I really love about that work is that it's a callback to the idea that cultural appropriation is sometimes used as a softening of things, right? Especially in the fashion industry. That's the example that's given there. That it's something that's forgivable. It was cultural appropriation, right? Mm-hmm. It's not considered a form of plagiarism, a form of stealing. It's cultural appropriation, right? Mm-hmm. It's forgivable. They didn't mean it. It was just hair, quote unquote, right? Mm-hmm. And so it has become a way to release people of the harm that they cause. In that particular article that I'm thinking about, I think it's 2017, there's a conversation about gender, right? How is cultural appropriation used in certain spaces that are gendered male or gendered female versus other forms of copyright infringement, for example, that are gendered masculine, right? Mm-hmm. In who's participating in, for example, academic spaces, right? Mm-hmm. In the publishing industry. Now we're talking about a legal question because it's copyright infringement. Mm-hmm. And so there's a question of, well, if cultural appropriation is used predominantly in terms of fashion, the argument then is that it becomes gendered, right? And so, we don't need to pay as close of attention to it because this is just a space built for women, right? It's the fashion industry.
Now, are you speaking of the article by Minha Pham?
Yes.
The paper. Okay.
Yes, absolutely. And so what that author does is talks about like what are the gendered lines through which we talk about cultural appropriation as something that can be forgiven, or this question of an infringement, which is something that can be legally taken up, right? And how do those spaces get gendered? And then there's a question of class, right? Who has the ability to have those things taken as seriously, like this is an infringement on questions of class and race. So all of these things sort of factor in. When I personally talk to students about cultural appropriation, when I talk to my 12-year-old about it, frankly, I talk about it in terms of this is taking somebody's culture without referencing that culture, without giving back to that culture, without being invited in by that culture. Participating in it causes harm. Is that the type of harm you want to cause people? And so for me, it is the act of it can be that clear cut. How it comes out in forms of expression, how it's actually enacted is much more muddy, right? And so I don't want to ever say that there aren't situations where things can't be left unclear. But then for me, it's that question of, are you willing to admit that you are wrong, right? So I'll very quickly tell you, one of the stories I always tell my students is that as a K-12 teacher, as a college professor, regardless in education, I'll say, you'll have a scenario where you'll have a student who just drove you absolutely crazy. I mean, they bothered you. They got under your skin. This idea that all teachers love all students, it's a myth. Okay. Teachers are people too. Right. And time will pass and that student will come back to your classroom and they'll say like, I really miss your class. And you're thinking like, you missed me? You missed me. Are you kidding me? Like every day was a struggle with you in the classroom. And you're thinking, how did I accidentally help that student that I didn't really like? Right? I accidentally helped them. They really loved it. They loved my class. There was something about it that really spoke to them, that resonated with them. And for every moment that you can accidentally help a student, you can accidentally harm a student. And you have to be really very real about that responsibility, right? I like people to think about it as educators because I think that we've had in our lives, if you've gone through the K-12 system here in the United States, you may have been on that side of things as the student, where you thought like, God, I really love that teacher. And who knows how they felt about you, right? This is not a call, by the way, not to go back to your teachers and thank them. Always thank your teachers, okay? But when we do things that somebody says that's cultural appropriation, we have to be willing to say, I didn't recognize that I was causing harm. It can help as much as we harm. And we have to be very real about that. And so a big part of it for me is saying, how is it what I did was not something that I thought was harmful that really was? And on the other side of it, if you say to somebody like, hey, if you were to come up to my son in however many years, if he were to Kurtha and say like, that's cultural appropriation. And he says like, look, I have a mom who's half Indian and I've lived part of my life in India. This is a part of my culture. Are you willing to say like, okay, I was wrong. I'm so sorry about that. Right? Are you willing to approach people with questions rather than answers? Right? Those are always the things that I like to foreground when we have these conversations because they are complicated, because they are muddy. The way that I define cultural appropriation, especially with this element of you financially benefit, or you benefit in some form of capital. Okay. So whether it is financial capital or cultural capital, right? Your ability to have cultural mobility. Cultural capital is this idea like you can have cultural mobility with things that aren't necessarily always connected to finances, right? So I always give the example of like the kid in the classroom who is the class clown, who has mobility because he has a sense of humor that speaks to his fellow students, right? So there's not necessarily financial capital involved in that. But so if you are taking from another culture and you gain some form of capital from that and you do not have any touchstones with that culture and you're not giving back to that culture and you're not recognizing that culture, we're in danger, right? Because you're not giving back and because you weren't invited in. And this is not to say that everybody has to be invited in also for all things. This is not to say that if you go to your local Indian restaurant and you have Indian food and you love Indian food, that you can't eat it just because you're not Indian, right? Like, I don't want to get into that conversation. And so at the same time, we have to be very careful about how these things get enacted, whose voices we keep out, which voices we temper, right? And all of these things need to always already be in play. If we think of it as this, like, you're wrong, I'm right, this is very clear cut. And at the same time, there are certain things that are incredibly clear cut from my perspective, like the Washington Redskins, like the Braves chop. Those are things that are not, like my daughter's school play with Peter Pan. Those are things that are not appropriate. So there are moments that it's very clear cut. It's both and. It is both clear. It is also muddy. We really need to enter into it with some curiosity and questions, and then the ability to say, I messed that up. How can I do better? Right? Because we do have the ability to do better. It's not Jay Smooth is an influencer on, I don't know which platform, but he has this talk where he discusses questions of race through this dental hygiene metaphor. And he says there are a lot of people who talk about it like getting their, like, a molar removed, right? Like, oh, I had my racism removed. And he talks about it like it should be like brushing your teeth. We get up in the morning, many people brush their teeth. You go to bed, you brush your teeth, assuming that you have access, frankly, to dental hygiene tools, right? So when we think about questions of race, questions of sex, gender expression, religion, home language, all of those things, and our bias, then it's really a question of how do I engage consistently in this reflexive process of, for lack of all better terms, brushing your teeth every day, twice a day, rather than just saying, oh, I thought about it once and I'm done. So if somebody's thinking about cultural appropriation and they're saying, like, okay, they listen to this podcast, for example, and they say, like, okay, I'm actually left with more questions than answers, I would say, absolutely great. That's what I want. I want you to have more questions, less answers, and to be able to say, I don't know, I may have been wrong, and I'm willing to engage consistently until I come to something that makes sense, not just to me, but in and across communities.
That's good. Being comfortable with the questions, I think, is a really thoughtful way to approach a conversation like this. So I will say, kind of, what is your general view of someone like me, a creator, a social media person who is attempting to have these conversations in little 3 to 5 minute little bites, like, here, let me throw this thing out in front of you and let's consider this topic. Obviously, in the academic space in which you exist, that would be ill-advised. That's not the way that you would approach it, because you're approaching it in a much more holistic way, and you're approaching it in a way that allows people to be much more thoughtful and to have a much broader framework for understanding these questions once they leave your space. But in an online space, that is almost impossible. Is it a foolhardy task? Is it something that probably should not be engaged in? I mean, I had to learn when I first started the type of work that I'm doing, when TikTok was a minute. It's like, okay, there were topics that I tried to address in a minute that I could not address. And I can look back and say, I probably shouldn't have tried to talk about this topic in a minute. And there are topics like this that, from our conversation here today, I would leave with the impression that, hey, this is probably not something that we can just have in little, 3-minute little snippets online. This is a much deeper conversation, and it really leaves a lot of room for inconclusive sort of statements to be made, and misunderstandings, and just generalizations that are not necessarily helpful. I mean, how do you feel about this, the idea of this conversation being had on platforms like TikTok and Instagram, where people are half the time just watching 30 to 60, maybe 90 seconds of a 3 to 5 minute video? Is this even an efficient or viable way to have this conversation?
Well, I think that an academic who tells you that I need to stay in the academy is gatekeeping knowledge. I think that is a really harmful understanding. I am guessing. I don't know you well enough to aside from, looking at the videos, I can't make this determination, but I'm guessing, just a guess, that you probably do a lot of research that goes into those 3 minutes. It's not like you just turned on a mic and you said, okay, I'm just going to talk for 3 minutes about this thing that I feel, right? And this is not to say that you don't have experience and that what you feel isn't valid, right? So always for me, that's sort of both and. What I would say is that in the middle of those complications, it's a great starting point, right? You can't get all the information out, but I can't get all the information out. I mean, I have 2 solo authored books on topics. Ask me if I think at the end of those 2 solo authored books, where I had all the pages to get through these ideas, these complex ideas, if I think that I got all the ideas out. I did not. Ask me if when I wrote those books, if I don't think differently about them now than I did even when they were published. I absolutely do, right? That's the thing about engaging deeply with the idea of thinking, right? Is that it should always be and now, right? It's always the next for me. So it is, again, it's a both and. It is this a great starting point? And do you recognize that as a good starting point? And does your audience recognize it as a good starting point? Right? Rather than watching either all 3 minutes, which would be great. There's a lot of information packed into there. There's also something that you do that I've noticed in your videos is you cite the ideas that that you're using, right? You don't just use an idea and not have any citation for it. I've seen on social media platforms where folks don't. And then when we think about plagiarism and the dangers of it, we're already in that territory.
Yeah.
This is not to say that you have to cite every idea, but so I think for me, when I say like, is it a foolhardy task? No. Do I think that I have students who engage with that? I've had students send me TikToks. I've had students send me your TikToks. Like, oh, okay, cool. I think I saw that one actually. And as a way to, I use that as assignments for, do they understand the weekly readings? Find me a social media source that you think speaks back to this reading, either against it or for it. So I think that when we think about what social media can give us, it can give us this plethora of ideas. It can be dangerous because the algorithm steers us towards ideas, right? As an academic, as an academic who works with qualitative research, specifically ethnographic research, I work on what's called massively over-determined information, which is that I see something in a context so many times that it speaks back to itself. With social media is that when you are in that loop of what the social media is feeding you, because that's what you want to see, it could be very easy to say, okay, I've now fallen into confirmation bias. This is exactly what I thought it was, right? So the question is, are you being curious, right? Are you being curious? Is your audience being curious? If what you say doesn't quite hit what they agree with, are they curious enough as people to say, let me go look at some other places and say, is this going to confirm, deny my feelings? Am I going to be pushed into the into the discomfort of not knowing? Right? Am I okay in that discomfort? Those are all questions I think we should all be asking. And so with any social media that is educational, and I do consider your work as educational social media, do you have the right to educate? Yeah, absolutely. Right. I'm not going to gatekeep that. Do you have the responsibility to be as well read as you can be? And I say that as you can be because there are paywalls for academic stuff that gatekeeps the ability to the access to information. But I think if we all approach this as a not yet question, there's a woman, Maxine Green in my field, who says, I am now what I'm not yet. And so can we look at this conversation as a not yet? And say, if it is not yet, if we don't yet know all of the answers because it is so complicated, can we lean into it together with a sense of curiosity and openness that I think you approach your work with? I think if that's what educational social media can give us, right? So that my student scrolling by says, okay, wait, I heard this thing. Now I'm going to think about it in this other place also. But knowing that even social media can feed into our own bias and being critical of that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so important. Well, I would like to ask you two things before we go. I would like for you to give us a few resources that people who want to study this topic more deeply can utilize. So can you give us a couple of names of books or, documentaries, or what do you recommend that people check out to understand these issues better?
I'm trying to, sorry, my office lights like to turn off on me after so long of sitting. As far as resources go, I think just one of the things I like to do when I am not sure about something is I will go to scholar.google.com.
Mm-hmm.
And I will just type in the search terms that I'm curious about, because it gives you a whole different set of reading things.
Mm-hmm.
But I think rather than providing because sometimes academic resources are very discipline specific, rather than providing you a list of that, I would ask you to start looking at the historical lenses of the things that you are curious about as just a starting block, and saying, how does this historical lens, first of all, who's telling me about the historical lens, from whose history and whose version of history is it being written? And then really engaging deeply. I can probably, I don't know if you have the ability to link some things. I can send you some resources if people
I can.
Clear resources.
Yep.
But I would rather leave that a little bit for the purpose of this moment. I'm going to leave it a little open-ended and say, really start leaning into your curiosities. And then thinking about layers of power. It's always layered. It's always nested and layered. So if I'm reading or watching this documentary, which is a powerful one, who's telling me the story, right? Who had the money to produce it? What is the bias that is sort of undergirding what I'm watching right now? And just always being critical. And critical, as I tell my students, just because you're critical doesn't mean give you the right to be an asshole, right? There's a difference between a respectful critique of something and just going after somebody because you have the license to do it behind the anonymity of a keyboard.
Right.
So I think moving in those ways becomes the most significant thing you can do.
Okay. Well, I will, if you can send me even just a couple of resources that you would recommend, or just authors in general, whatever you're checking out, or would recommend that people who are, again, not necessarily existing in the academic or scholarly space could check out to help them get their heads around this better. Because there are a lot of people who really do, they just want to understand better. They want to do better. They have a desire to move more carefully through the world. And so I always want to give those people the opportunity to learn on a deeper level than what they're ever going to get from my little 3-minute assessment online.
I think I want to pause you on that and say that that's undermining the work that you do. And I think they should appreciate the work that you do. But also, I do want to say to folks who are looking for other resources, thank you for doing that, and not for putting the labor on minoritized communities to tell you what's right and what's wrong for them, for their bodies, for the communities and cultures with which they're touching and are touched by. So I think that sort of work at a base level as an ally is just necessary. So thank you for that work.
Yeah, absolutely. And then lastly, I mean, this might not be a great way to end, because you may or may not even have a comment about it, but I don't know how familiar you are with Paul Simon's Graceland album, because this is the next place that I'm going, because I love to tell stories around music, musicians, entertainment in general, film, television, and how those things in the real world interact with these issues around race and culture. And so this is a big story for me. I'm spending several days, I mean, it's probably been close to a week now, just sort of teasing out this script and really, as you said, doing the research and understanding and listening to the music and really asking myself some questions about how I feel about this work. So I don't know how familiar you are with this album. Paul, I'll just say for general reference for those who are listening, Paul Simon made an album called Graceland in 1986, where he utilized South African musicians to make an album that fused his style, which was kind of a singer-songwriter style pop, with the South African, the style of the South African townships at the height of apartheid. So this was very controversial, and there were a lot of accusations that flowed around. But do you have just a very quick and dirty assessment of just, this is how that hit me? This is how, I grapple with that project, that just the existence of it. I'm sure we've all heard singles, You Can Call Me Al and Diamonds on the Soles of Her Shoes. And, these were kind of ubiquitous songs at that time. But do you kind of have, even if you don't have a comment specifically about that album, but the idea of, a white American musician kind of fusing their sound with the sound of this very much oppressed and repressed culture that was going through a very, very difficult time politically and still is. I mean, what's your kind of general assessment of that?
Again, I don't necessarily know that it's my place to comment about from a musician standpoint, right?
Mm-hmm.
As to how these things rolled. What I can say is that very much was Paul Simon's work was a strong facet of my childhood, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so being a child of the 80s, grew up listening to it, never really thinking twice about it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that I'm sure if I were to go to, my dad's house, I would see maybe records still sitting around. And it wasn't until I was an adult and watched like the music videos that I started saying like, oh, wait, what am I not getting here?
Wow.
I remember as a young person, so my biological father, both my dads are from India, but my biological father grew up for a portion of his childhood in Mombasa, right?
Mm.
And then for the rest of the time of his childhood in Goa, India, which is a very different sort of feel from it than the rest of India in terms of colonization and histories and things like that. I remember listening to Paul Simon's work as a young person and saying, like, there's something about this beat, there's something about the sound that is categorically different than everything else I'm hearing. And watching my dad move differently to that music than he did to other music, unless he was, listening to songs in Konkani or other languages that he grew up with, and other musical styles that he grew up to. And just watching his own body just sort of move differently to it, right? So I, as a young person who grew up in an overwhelmingly white space in the Midwest, really sort of fell into okay, well, this feels different and I don't know why, right? Mm-hmm. And then as an adult had to really have a strong reevaluation of something that I had such a clear point in my childhood with, and say like, whoa, I don't know what's going on here, but this doesn't feel right. Now it doesn't feel right. And then start asking other questions about music, right? For me, the curiosity was like, how do I understand not only Paul Simon's work, but how do I understand music altogether? When we have I won't say fused, but like laid your musical understandings on top of other cultures in a particular way. And I still have not yet come to terms with all of it. I'm still wrestling with it. I continue to say, I don't know. But to say that there are lots of parts about that album and the politics behind it that I still am not completely aware of, that I still remain curious about. But to say that even growing up with something and then watching it through the lens of an academic, it gave me a lot of pause and saying, in my gut, this doesn't feel good. And then trusting my gut and saying like, okay, well, let's really think more deeply about these things.
So interesting. Well, I'm glad I got your comments on that, because I'm always curious to hear kind of where people settle on issues related to the real world. Yeah. People who've had to delve into these topics deeply, and then to take a real world example like that and just kind of see where you're sitting with it at this point. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. Yeah, and I hope you have the chance to see the piece that I'm going to do on it. I don't even know where I'm settling with it. So I think, being okay with, as you said, more questions than answers is a place that I'm getting to, although it's not the most satisfying thing in social media context. People definitely like for you to be able to come down very conclusively about certain things. And I've certainly gotten into hot water or trouble myself from not making maybe declarative statements around things. But I think being able to stay in that place of questioning and being comfortable with the questions, which I think is one of the themes of this conversation, and just the way that you approach these topics is just going to have to be okay. It's going to have to be okay in relation to that specific work of art. So just thank you so much again, Dr. Boni Wozolek, for your expertise, for your thoughts, for your conversation, for your time. and for sharing something with us that we don't necessarily get to experience often here in the real world. If we're not sitting in a classroom, we may not get to hear from someone as well informed and as thoughtful as you are about a topic like this. So just thank you for taking the time to take this little journey with us.
Well, thank you very much for your time today too, and for your work.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you so much.